Chiang Kai-Shek, an influential individual in contemporary Chinese history, was born on October 31, 1887, in the town of Shiku, located in Fenghua County, Zhejiang Province, in eastern China. This small town lay just across Hangzhou Bay from the bustling city of Shanghai, a region already playing a significant role in China's commercial and cultural exchanges. Chiang's father, Zhang Zhaokong, was a moderately prosperous merchant who expanded his family's traditional business of salt trading to include commodities such as rice wine, vegetables, and other goods. His entrepreneurial spirit helped elevate the family's social standing. Chiang's mother, Wang Chayu, bore 4 children with Zhaokong, of whom Chiang was the third. Chiang's early life was marked by both privilege and hardship. His family's moderate wealth provided some stability, but this was cut short when Chiang's father passed away in 1895, leaving his mother to navigate the family through challenging times. Chiang later described himself as being virtually orphaned, though his mother continued to play a vital role in his upbringing, instilling in him values of resilience and perseverance. Chiang's formative years unfolded during a period of immense upheaval in China. By the mid-19th century, China's centuries-old policy of isolation had been forcibly dismantled. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, had ended in humiliation for the Qing dynasty, with Britain coercing China to open its ports to trade, particularly for British opium from India. This defeat marked the beginning of the so-called Century of Humiliation, during which foreign powers imposed unequal treaties, seized territories, and undermined China's sovereignty. Neighboring nations like Japan and Korea faced similar pressures from Western imperial powers. Japan adapted more effectively, undertaking rapid modernization during the Meiji Restoration. By the 1880s, Japan had emerged as a regional power with a Western-style government and military. In contrast, China struggled between factions, traditionalists and reformers. Even among the reformers, there were divisions between those advocating a conservative republic rooted in Confucian values and radicals inspired by socialist ideologies from Europe. These tensions created a volatile environment in which Chiang grew up. In 1906, at the age of 19, Chiang decided to take control of his future by traveling to Japan, the most modernized nation in East Asia. Japan's recent victory in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, had demonstrated its military prowess and ability to challenge Western powers. Chiang enrolled at the Shinbu Gakko Military Academy in Tokyo, which served as a training ground for many Chinese students. The academy was not just a place of military instruction, but also a hotbed of political radicalism, where revolutionary ideas flourished. One of the key movements influencing students at the academy was the Tongmenghui, or United League, a secret society founded in 1905 by Sun Yat-sen. A physician turned revolutionary, Sun Yat-sen had been inspired by his experiences in the United States and Europe. He formulated his political philosophy around the 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and welfare. Sun's ultimate goal was the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, which he criticized as not only outdated, but also a regime dominated by the Manchu ethnic minority. Chiang became closely associated with Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionary movement. This alliance would define the trajectory of Chiang's career and lay the foundation for his rise to prominence in Chinese politics. Between 1909 and 1911, Chiang continued his military training in Japan while simultaneously deepening his involvement with Chinese revolutionary groups. His time in Japan exposed him to new military techniques and modern strategies, which would later prove invaluable in his leadership roles. Chiang returned to China in late 1911 during a momentous turning point in the nation's history. That autumn, the Wuchang Uprising ignited what would become known as the Shinai Revolution. This nationwide rebellion aimed to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a republic. The revolution marked the culmination of years of frustration with the Qing government's inability to resist foreign domination or address internal corruption and stagnation. Chiang's arrival coincided with a period of immense political and social upheaval, setting the stage for his active participation in shaping the future of a fractured and transitioning China. By 1908, the Qing dynasty was already teetering on the edge of collapse. The succession of the 2-year-old Emperor Puyi following the death of Emperor Guangxu and Empress Dowager Cixi, left the imperial government without the strong leadership it desperately needed. This weakened state, combined with growing public discontent in revolutionary activity, accelerated the decline of the ancient imperial system. By late 1911, revolutionaries, emboldened by years of underground movements and armed uprisings, launched the Shinai Revolution. The imperial system, which had governed China for over 2,000 years, crumbled within weeks. On January 1, 1912, the Republic of China was officially established, marking a seismic shift in the nation's history. Sun Yat-sen, the charismatic revolutionary leader and the architect of the three principles of the people, nationalism, democracy, and people's welfare, was appointed as the Republic's provisional president. His leadership symbolized hope for a new modern China, but the road ahead was fraught with challenges. By the time of the Republic's formation, Chiang Kai-Shek had become an active figure in the revolutionary circles of Shanghai. He frequently traveled between Shanghai and the new Republic's capital, Beijing, further entrenching himself in the evolving political landscape. In the autumn of 1912, Chiang joined Sun Yat-sen in founding the Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, KMT. The KMT emerged as the successor to the revolutionary Tongmenghui. This political alliance aimed to unify the fragmented nation and establish a stable government. Despite the Republic's promise, its early years were marked by chaos. Warlords, remnants of the old imperial system, carved out autonomous territories in various provinces, creating a patchwork of fiefdoms. Compounding this instability, Sun Yat-sen and the KMT faced fierce opposition from the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party was formed in 1913 under Wen Shikai. Yuan, a seasoned Qing general, sought to consolidate power, even attempting to restore the monarchy in 1915 by declaring himself emperor. His actions plunged China into a state of near civil war, with various factions vying for control. During this tumultuous period, Chiang Kai-Shek remained a relatively minor figure within the KMT. He served as a liaison between Sun Yat-sen's faction and their allies in Japan, shuttling between Shanghai and Tokyo. Few could have foreseen the pivotal role he would play in China's future. Amidst the political upheaval, Chiang's personal life was equally complex. In 1901, at just 14 years old, he entered an arranged marriage with Mao Fumei, a 19-year-old woman from his village. The union, orchestrated to provide financial stability for the family following the death of Chiang's father, was far from harmonious. Mao Fumei, though devoted, struggled to find common ground with Chiang. Chiang adhered to the traditional practice of concubinage, taking mistresses who occupied roles akin to secondary wives. In 1912, he began a relationship with Yao Yeqing, a significant figure in his personal life. These relationships reflected the social norms of the era, but also added layers of complexity to Chiang's already multifaceted life. The fledgling republic struggled to assert control over the vast Chinese landscape. Yuan Shikai's authoritarian tendencies alienated many, including Sun Yat-sen, who led a short-lived Second Revolution against Yuan in 1913. While the revolt failed, it underscored the deep divisions within the country. Yuan's death in 1916 further fragmented China, as provincial warlords seized the opportunity to expand their power. These warlords often wielded private armies and ruled their territories like independent kingdoms. This created a fractured and chaotic political environment. For the KMT, unifying the country under a centralized government seemed an almost insurmountable task. Chiang Kai-Shek, still a mid-ranking member of the movement, observed these developments closely, gaining valuable insights into the political and military strategies he would later employ. Chiang Kai-Shek's personal life during the 1920s was as intricate as his political rise. In 1921, he began a relationship with Chen Jiru, a 15-year-old girl he had first met several years earlier. This relationship overlapped with others in his life, and some historical accounts suggest that Chiang effectively had multiple wives. However, his marriage to Mao Fumei officially ended in divorce in 1921, when his relationship with Chen Jiru became more formalized. From these unions, only one biological child was born, Chiang Ching-kuo, born in 1910 to Mao Fumei. Chiang also adopted a son, Chiang Wei-kuo, in the mid-1910s. The latter was the illegitimate child of an associate of Chiang's in Japan who surrendered the child for fear of public disgrace. These familial dynamics added layers of complexity to Chiang's personal narrative, intertwining traditional practices with the demands of his political aspirations. As China grappled with internal instability, Chiang's political career underwent significant shifts. By 1919, Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionary allies, including Chiang, restructured their political base. They founded the Kuomintang, PKMT, or the National People's Party, as a successor to earlier nationalist organizations. Headquartered in Guangdong, the KMT aimed to unify the fractured nation through armed struggle. The KMT pursued alliances with various groups, including the Soviet Union, which had established the communist regime after the 1917 Russian Revolution. In 1923, Sun Yat-sen dispatched Chiang to Moscow to secure Soviet aid and observe the Red Army's military system. Although Chiang studied the Soviet model, he remained skeptical of its applicability to China, preferring a system tailored to Chinese conditions. While Sun Yat-sen is celebrated today as an ideological forefather of Chinese communism, the KMT evolved into a staunchly anti-communist organization after his death in March 1925. Chiang Kai-shek's ascent within the party marked his significant ideological shift, steering the nationalists toward a different vision for China. The turning point in Chiang's political and military career was the Northern Expedition, a large-scale military campaign launched by the KMT in the summer of 1926. The goal was twofold: to defeat the warlords who ruled northern China and to consolidate power under a centralized government. At the start of the campaign in July 1926, Chiang commanded fewer than 100,000 troops, a modest force in a nation as vast as China. However, Chiang's military strategy proved remarkably effective. His forces swiftly captured the provinces of Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian by the end of 1926. As his army advanced, it grew significantly, both in manpower and resources. By the spring of 1927, when Chiang's forces targeted Shanghai and Nanjing, he commanded a formidable force of over 500,000 troops. The campaign achieved remarkable success, securing central China and establishing a provisional government in Nanjing in the late spring of 1927. The Northern Expedition continued through 1927 and into 1928, eventually unifying much of the country under KMT rule. This brought a semblance of stability to China, ending over 15 years of division and chaos that had plagued the republic since its founding in 1912. Despite these successes, cracks began to emerge within the KMT during the Northern Expedition. Ideological divisions between right-leaning nationalists and left-leaning communist factions within the party deepened. Chiang Kai-shek, increasingly a dominant figure in the KMT, orchestrated a purge of communists from the party in 1927, leading to a violent and bloody schism. This event, known as the White Terror, marked the beginning of open hostilities between the nationalists and communists. While today the KMT is often viewed as a right-wing organization, it retained elements of socialism under Chiang's leadership, particularly during the early stages of the civil conflict. However, the growing anti-communist stance of the party under Chiang's control solidified its reputation as the ideological counterweight to the rising Communist Party of China, CPC. In the early 1920s, the Kuomintang, KMT, was a dynamic and fluid political movement that housed both left-wing and right-wing factions. While the right-wing faction began to consolidate under Chiang's leadership, the left wing, led by Wang Jingwei, gained momentum through alliances with communist figures and Soviet advisors active in China. The ideological chasm widened significantly during the Northern Expedition. By the final months of 1926, the left-wing faction, increasingly dominated by communists, had established a stronghold in Wuhan, which briefly served as the KMT's headquarters. This division signaled the beginning of a broader rift within the nationalist movement, even before Chiang's forces secured the strategic cities of Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927. Chiang Kai-shek's conservative allies in the KMT viewed the growing influence of communism within the party as an existential threat. After capturing Shanghai and Nanjing, Chiang initiated a violent campaign to suppress communist elements. The most infamous episode of this repression occurred on April 12, 1927, in Shanghai. Acting on Chiang's orders, KMT military units began purging communist groups in the city, targeting labor unions, student organizations, and leftist activists. Thousands were arrested, and many were executed in brutal crackdowns. These purges extended to other cities under KMT control, with similar incidents unfolding throughout the following months. By late summer 1927, it became evident that communists would need to directly oppose KMT leadership to survive. The suppression of communists under Chiang's leadership marked a definitive turning point in Chinese history. On August 1, 1927, left-wing members of the KMT launched an armed uprising in Nanchang, widely regarded as the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. This date is also celebrated in Chinese communist history as the birth of the People's Liberation Army. Key figures in this initial resistance included Zhu Dai, Zhou Enlai, and Ye Ting. At this stage, Mao Zedong was a relatively minor figure within the communist movement. Although he participated in early uprisings, his significant leadership role would only emerge in the 1930s, particularly during the Long March and the consolidation of communist power. The split between the KMT and the Communist Party of China was complete by the end of 1927, with the two factions entrenched in a bitter ideological and military struggle that would last for decades. This conflict not only shaped the course of modern Chinese history, but also reflected the broader global struggle between nationalism and communism during the 20th century. The period surrounding the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War was tumultuous in Chiang Kai-shek's personal life. However, it also marked a turning point that brought lasting stability to his romantic relationships. Back in the late 1910s, during the formative years of the Kuomintang, Chiang had met Soong Mei-ling, the youngest daughter of Charlie Soong, a prominent Chinese businessman with American connections. Charlie Soong, who had studied in the United States, was a Christian convert and an influential figure in Chinese business and politics. The Soong family became one of the most prominent families in China. Mei-ling's sister, Soong Ching-ling, famously married to Sun Yat-sen during the last decade of his life. Initially, the Soong family discouraged Mei-ling from pursuing a relationship with Chiang. Their opposition stemmed from several factors: Chiang's existing marriage and concubines, his reputation, and the significant age gap between the two. However, by the mid-1920s, Chiang and Mei-ling began spending more time together. In 1927, Chiang divorced his wife, Chen Jieru, and ended his concubine relationship with Yao Yecheng to marry Soong Mei-ling. This marriage marked a new chapter in Chiang's personal life. For the rest of his life, he remained broadly monogamous. A departure from his earlier years, Mei-ling became a prominent figure within the KMT and played an influential role in Chinese politics, diplomacy, and charity work. Although the couple did not have children, Mei-ling may have suffered a miscarriage in 1928. From 1927 onward, even as the civil war between the nationalists and communists raged, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang leadership embarked on a period of governance and reform known as the Nanjing Decade. This era, so named because the capital remained in Nanjing even after Beijing was seized, was marked by significant strides in economic, social, and infrastructural development. Under nationalist rule, China's economy began to modernize. A key feature of this progress was the cooperative movement, which revolutionized industries such as cotton production. The number of factories surged, reflecting the growing industrial base. Additionally, significant strides were made in transportation infrastructure. By 1936, the length of modern highways in China had quadrupled compared to 1927, thanks to an ambitious road-building initiative led by the nationalists. The nationalist government prioritized social reforms, particularly in education, expanding access and increasing literacy rates. Efforts were made to standardize curricula and improve access to schools, especially in urban centers. Basic infrastructure, long neglected, saw remarkable improvements. An efficient postal system was established, ensuring better communication across the vast country. Similarly, the creation of an operational banking system helped stabilize the economy and encourage investment. While the Nanjing Decade was not without its flaws, critics pointed to corruption, inequality, and uneven reforms, progress was undeniable in key areas. These advancements laid the groundwork for further modernization, despite the Civil War and Japanese threat. Despite strides in infrastructure and industrialization, rural areas often remained neglected, and millions of peasants lived in poverty. Chiang Kai-Shek's authority was far from absolute, with the nationalist movement being a coalition of diverse factions. Power ebbed and flowed among these groups, and the decade following the Northern Expedition saw increasing discord. By 1928, when the expedition unified much of China, it was evident that the nationalists were far from ideologically unified. Internal divisions and rivalries escalated into factional conflicts, undermining the cohesion of the movement. As a leader of the right wing of the Kuomintang, Chiang represented a stark contrast to the left-wing communist branch. While the communists embraced modernity and socialism, Chiang's ideology was rooted in tradition. He sought to revive Confucianism, aligning his political philosophy with a nostalgic vision of China's past, contrasting with Sun Yat-sen's modern liberalism. Sun Yat-sen admired Western intellectuals like John Locke and Theodore Roosevelt, shaping his vision for a modern, democratic China. In contrast, Chiang leaned toward authoritarianism and tradition, evident in the New Life movement of the 1930s. The New Life movement, spearheaded by the nationalists, sought to promote Neo-Confucian values and instill moral discipline in society. It aimed to counteract moral decay from rapid modernization and foreign influences. Central to the movement was the Blue Shirt Society, a paramilitary organization mirroring European fascist movements. Inspired by Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts, it advocated a blend of Confucian corporatism and authoritarianism. This alignment with fascist ideals highlighted contradictions in Chiang's political philosophy, attempting to blend traditional Chinese values with authoritarian modernity emerging in Europe. Chiang was a complex and contradictory figure. Publicly, Chiang presented himself as a conservative stalwart and defender of Chinese traditions. However, his personal behavior often undermined this image, being erratic, violent, and oppressive, even toward his closest associates. On multiple occasions, Chiang physically assaulted members of his staff, showcasing a volatile temper at odds with the moral uprightness he advocated. Corruption was another glaring contradiction, undermining his government's effectiveness. Despite his public disdain for immoral behavior, Chiang tolerated and even fostered corruption within the Kuomintang, alienating many of his supporters. The conflicting ideologies and global influences of the era were evident in the lives of Chiang's sons. His adopted son, Chiang Wei-kuo, was sent to Germany and became a junior officer in the Wehrmacht, participating in the Nazi annexation of Austria. Meanwhile, his biological son, Chiang Ching-kuo, spent many years in Soviet Russia, absorbing communist ideas. These differing experiences illustrate the intricate and frequently conflicting environment in which Chiang functioned. A constant characteristic in Chiang's beliefs was his extreme nationalism. His 1943 work, China's Destiny, illustrated this by depicting foreigners with xenophobic contempt. The tone of the book was so harsh that an American military analyst compared it to Hitler's Mein Kampf. Although he had ideological shortcomings, Chiang was a fairly competent military leader. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, he effectively directed efforts that increased nationalist dominance across a large portion of China. His capacity to unify power, although not fully realized, positioned him as an important player in China's political and military scene during this chaotic period. By the end of the 1920s, Chiang Kai-Shek and the Nationalists had attained significant victories in the Chinese Civil War. They had seized control of nearly all of eastern China, encompassing its key cities along the coast. This centralization of authority marginalized the Chinese Communist movement, restricting it to underdeveloped rural areas in provinces like Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, and Shanxi. During this period, Mao Zedong was rising as an important leader in the Communist Party. Nonetheless, his impact was still emerging, and it wouldn't be until the 1940s for him to achieve prominence. By the early 1930s, the communist movement in China was nearing its collapse. In the fall of 1933, Chiang initiated his fifth and most ambitious campaign to encircle the communists in Jiangxi province. His approach was methodical and deliberate, to deprive the Red Army of supplies and surround their positions with fortified outposts. Throughout a year-long campaign, the nationalist forces nearly succeeded in completely annihilating the communist movement. Nonetheless, the communists were able to avoid destruction in late 1934. Troops of the Chinese Red Army penetrated the nationalist siege, initiating what would eventually be legendary as the Long March. This arduous, year-long trek spanned almost 6,000 miles and led the communist troops through some of the toughest landscapes in China, ranging from mountains to swamps. Despite experiencing catastrophic losses, with tens of thousands dying throughout the struggle, the communists endured. The Long March evolved into a representation of communist determination and was enshrined in propaganda as a courageous fight for liberty. Although faced with this setback, Chiang and the Nationalists maintained the advantage in the Civil War. By the mid-1930s, they were on the verge of attaining total success. Only external circumstances, especially the growing danger from Japan, stopped the Nationalists from completely eliminating the communist movement. In December 1936, Chiang encountered a personal crisis that almost resulted in his death. During his visit to Xian, Shanxi province, to inspect the troops based in the area, he was captured in an event that came to be called the Xian incident. Chiang's trip to Xian aimed to tackle problems in the military, specifically the reluctance of some divisions to fight against the communists. Unbeknownst to him, supporters of communism had penetrated the military's ranks. On December 12, 1936, troops invaded the location where Chiang was residing and captured him. The announcement of his capture caused chaos within the nationalist government in Nanjing. In the meantime, the communists recognized a chance to exploit Chiang's difficulties for their benefit. Zhou Enlai, a high-ranking communist leader who would eventually emerge as a key figure in communist China, was dispatched to Xi'an to discuss matters with Chiang. During a 2-week period, Zhou and Chiang came to a consensus. In return for his freedom, Chiang committed to cease conflicts with the communists and concentrate on fighting against Japanese aggression. On December 26, 1936, Chiang was released and came back to Nanjing. As he promised, he called for a temporary halt to hostilities. Nonetheless, the Xi'an incident revealed significant splits within the nationalist ranks regarding the approach to tackle the communist threat going forward. As China grappled with civil war, an even more significant danger approached: Japanese imperialism. By the early 20th century, Japan had evolved into a contemporary industrial and military force. Its goal was evident: to control the Far East and the Western Pacific. Japan's imperial aspirations became apparent as early as 1895 when it took control of Taiwan after winning the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1910, it officially incorporated Korea, thereby reinforcing its dominance in East Asia. In 1931, Japan entered Manchuria, taking control of the resource-abundant area in northeastern China and creating the puppet regime of Manchukuo. At that moment, China, caught up in its domestic conflicts, was hesitant to confront Japan in direct warfare. Nonetheless, Japan's hostility intensified in 1937. During the summer of that year, Japanese troops initiated a comprehensive invasion of China, seizing significant eastern cities such as Beijing and Shanghai. This signaled the onset of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a harsh struggle that would ravage China for 8 years and dramatically change the course of the Chinese Civil War. The diplomatic interactions between Chiang Kai-Shek and the Allies in World War II were vital for the continuation of the Chinese war effort. As the head of the nationalist government, Chiang participated in significant Allied meetings, such as the Cairo Conference in November 1943, where he interacted with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This represented a crucial point in China's position in the world. It confirmed China's status as one of the Big Four Allied nations, together with the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, in spite of the symbolic nature of these diplomatic initiatives, the actual assistance provided by the Allies to China was frequently restricted. Supply routes to Chongqing, like the Burma Road and later the Hump Airlift across the Himalayas, were crucial lifelines. Yet they were inadequate to fulfill the extensive demands of the Chinese war effort. The challenges endured by the Chinese populace and armed forces during this period were overwhelming. Widespread starvation, economic disaster, and the ongoing danger of Japanese attacks affected both nationalist and communist troops. The wartime era revealed significant divisions within the nationalist administration and armed forces. The corruption that afflicted the regime throughout the 1930s persisted relentlessly. This weakened morale and stoked discontent among the people. Chiang's failure or reluctance to address these abuses led to a decline in public confidence in his leadership. Concurrently, the communists, under Mao Zedong's leadership, presented themselves as advocates for the peasantry, executing land reforms. They fostered an image of integrity and discipline. The fraught partnership between the nationalists and communists during the conflict was marked by distrust and sporadic confrontations. Both factions were keenly aware that Japan's defeat would rekindle the Civil War, and they utilized the interim period to strengthen their standings. The communists increased their presence in rural regions, creating a support network that would become crucial in the post-war battle for dominance in China. When the war concluded in 1945, China was a country weary from almost 10 years of fighting. The triumph over Japan offered minimal relief. The scene was now prepared for the ultimate confrontation between the nationalists and communists. Chiang Kai-Shek came out of the conflict with an enhanced international stature, but a diminished standing at home. The corruption, inefficiency, and dependence on foreign aid of his regime had estranged numerous Chinese citizens. The communists presented themselves as a credible alternative. As the global focus turned to reconstructing Europe and the beginning of the Cold War, China's destiny remained uncertain. For Chiang Kai-Shek, the era following the war would present fresh challenges as he aimed to sustain control over a divided and exhausted nation. Mao Zedong's communist forces were poised to contest his authority. The nationalists experienced a severe blow due to the loss of significant American backing, which had been essential for their military campaign during World War II. Even though General George Marshall's effort to negotiate peace aimed to avert large-scale hostilities, it failed. Both parties were reluctant to make substantial concessions, and suspicion was profound. When Marshall left China in 1947, the United States had started to redirect its attention to post-war rebuilding in Europe and the rising Cold War with the Soviet Union. At the same time, the nationalist government confronted overwhelming difficulties. The Kuomintang fought to preserve stability and handle the wrecked economy, while the Chinese Communist Party took advantage of its increasing backing from the rural populace. Mao and his supporters utilized the war years to strengthen their power in rural areas, establish a large network of devoted cadres. They portrayed themselves as advocates for land reform and social equity. The Civil War that reignited in 1946 was vastly different from the strife of the 1930s. On this occasion, the communists were not the disadvantage. They had increased considerably in power and numbers, possessing a disciplined military and a structured administration in the regions they governed. The People's Liberation Army, guided by Mao and leaders such as Zhu Dai, implemented successful guerrilla warfare tactics and utilized their widespread backing to contest the nationalists' control over important areas. In contrast, the nationalists faced internal conflicts, diminishing resources, and a growingly disenchanted public. Inflation escalated uncontrollably, diminishing public trust in the government's capability to handle the economy. The Nationalist Army, despite being larger and having superior equipment, faced issues with low morale and widespread corruption within its ranks. Numerous soldiers abandoned their posts, while others switched allegiance to the communist faction. The communist troops steadily increased their strength, undertaking successful operations in northern and central China. One of their key triumphs occurred in 1948 during the Huaihai campaign, where the PLA strongly defeated the Nationalist Army in multiple battles throughout eastern China. This signified a pivotal moment in the conflict, as the nationalists had to fall back to their southern bases. By 1949, it was evident that the Civil War had shifted significantly in favor of the communists. Mao Zedong's troops seized key cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, which was the capital of the nationalists. Chiang Kai-Shek, acknowledging the certainty of loss, started making arrangements for his government's retreat to Taiwan, where he aimed to reorganize and sustain a resistance base. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, marking the completion of the communist triumph and the conclusion of the Civil War on the mainland. Chiang Kai-Shek and the remaining members of the nationalist government escaped to Taiwan, where they formed a government in exile and maintained their assertion of legitimacy as the Republic of China. The Civil War resulted in a nation that was profoundly divided. For Chiang Kai-Shek, it was a painful end to years of conflict, characterized by instances of victory, but ultimately marred by mismanagement, corruption, and strategic blunders. For Mao Zedong and the CCP, it marked the start of a new era in Chinese history, one that would present its own challenges as they aimed to convert China into a socialist nation. The formation of Chiang Kai-shek's administration in Taiwan in late 1949 signaled the start of a new phase in his career and in Chinese history. The Nationalists, also known as the Kuomintang, were forcefully removed from the mainland yet maintained their assertion as the rightful government of all China. For Chiang, this era represented a significant challenge as well as a chance to strengthen his authority and redefine his legacy. Taiwan, an island that has traditionally been marginal to Chinese governance, emerged as the central focus of the nationalist movement to reconstruct and oppose communist control. As soon as he reached Taiwan, Chiang quickly set out to establish his dominance. The island was subjected to martial law, a condition that would persist for many years. This allowed Chiang to exercise firm control over the populace and stifle any opposition. The February 28th incident of 1947 held significant importance in the shared memory of the Taiwanese population, and Chiang's administration labored diligently, albeit not always effectively, to justify its authority in the perspective of the island's citizens. Chiang's government in Taiwan emphasized military readiness, concerned about a possible invasion by the People's Liberation Army. Even though this invasion did not occur, the danger remained in the early 1950s, leading the nationalists to create a strong defensive system. The United States, motivated to restrain communist growth during the initial phase of the Cold War, emerged as a crucial partner. The onset of the Korean War in 1950 strengthened American backing for Chiang's regime, since Taiwan's strategic position in the Western Pacific positioned it as an essential ally in the wider campaign against Soviet and Chinese communist influence. Economic progress was another focus for the nationalist administration in Taiwan. Chiang's government, supported by significant U.S. assistance, enacted land reforms that reallocated wealth and strengthened the backing of Taiwan's rural communities. These reforms, while prompted by necessity, also stood in stark contrast to the corruption and mismanagement that defined the nationalist government on the mainland. Under Chiang's guidance, Taiwan initiated its change from a mainly agricultural society to an industrialized, export-oriented economy, a development that would subsequently be referred to as the Taiwan Miracle. Politically, Chiang maintained a strict and authoritarian control. Dissent was not allowed, and the government harshly silenced any possible challenges to its power. Thousands of political opponents were taken into custody during this time, with many being executed or incarcerated. This period of oppression became referred to as the White Terror, and its legacy continues to be a debated issue in Taiwanese society. Regardless of these oppressive actions, Chiang's governance effectively preserved stability and promoted economic development, leading to a gradual enhancement of living conditions for numerous Taiwanese. Globally, Chiang Kai-shek utilized Cold War geopolitics to secure the existence of his administration in Taiwan. The Republic of China maintained its hold on China's seat at the United Nations, which provided Chiang's government with a certain level of legitimacy internationally. Western nations, especially the United States, regarded Chiang as a defense against the expansion of communism in Asia and provided his administration with diplomatic and military backing. As the Cold War advanced, Chiang's aspiration of regaining the mainland started to diminish. In the 1950s, the nationalists initiated multiple small-scale attacks on the communist-held mainland, but these actions were mainly symbolic and yielded minimal results. By the 1960s, it became evident that the KMT was more concerned with keeping control of Taiwan than reclaiming China. For Chiang Kai-shek, losing the mainland was a difficult experience to endure. Nevertheless, his capacity to maintain the nationalist government in Taiwan and evolve the island into a flourishing economy and significant ally of the West showcased an extraordinary display of resilience. His leadership, while significantly imperfect, made a lasting impact on Taiwan in the larger context of 20th century Chinese history. After the chaotic withdrawal to Taiwan and the formation of his administration, Chiang Kai-shek's top focus was to secure the island and establish his dominance. This started with the declaration of martial law in 1949, a measure that would become a hallmark of his governance in Taiwan. The martial law aimed to curb any possible communist supporters, but it soon evolved into a wider initiative of political oppression referred to as the White Terror. The White Terror can be viewed as a continuation of the anti-communist purges that Chiang had executed on the mainland during the Northern Expedition in 1927. In Taiwan, on the other hand, the purges were significantly harsher and more extensive. The nationalist government, wary of potential opposition that might undermine their power, focused on not just genuine communist supporters, but also on anyone perceived as a threat to Chiang's rule. Tens of thousands of citizens in Taiwan faced imprisonment, and around 3,000 individuals were put to death. The campaign extended from the early 1950s to the late 1980s, with Chiang's regime occasionally loosening its hold on power. However, the initial years of the White Terror were characterized by pervasive fear and severe oppression. The rationale for this cruelty was primarily based on Chiang's conviction that Taiwan remained at risk of a communist takeover. The People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong, remained mindful of the nationalist government in Taiwan. Mao and his leadership aimed to reunite China and eliminate the opposing government, believing that the presence of the Republic of China on Taiwan directly challenged the legitimacy of the communist regime. The Chinese authorities perceived Taiwan not only as a significant strategic territory, but also as a key ideological conflict zone. In the time right after Chiang moved to Taiwan, it seemed the Chinese communists had a chance to reclaim the island. Nonetheless, the onset of the Korean War in 1950, along with China's involvement to support North Korea, led the United States to alter its policy. Confronted with possible communist hostility in the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. asserted that it would not accept an assault in Taiwan. This signified the onset of a steadfast American dedication to supporting Chiang's administration. In 1954, tensions escalated when communist forces attacked multiple smaller islands close to Taiwan, and again in 1958. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who traveled to Taiwan in 1960, reiterated American backing for Chiang. In early 1955, the U.S. Congress approved the Formosa Resolution, pledging support to Taiwan if it faced an invasion. This was additionally reinforced by a direct warning to Beijing that the United States might contemplate using nuclear weapons if China tried to invade Taiwan. The Chinese, not establishing their own nuclear capabilities until 1964, reconsidered, highlighting Taiwan's strategic significance during the Cold War. Nonetheless, the aspiration to reclaim the mainland was not solely a Chinese communist goal, but also a motivating factor for Chiang's administration. During the 1950s and 1960s, Chiang aimed to reinvigorate the nationalist campaign to regain the mainland by employing numerous military strategies. One of the boldest of these initiatives was the CIA's training of rebel factions under the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty. These rebels were meant to function within mainland China in collaboration with local anti-communist factions. In 1956, Chiang intended to deploy around 750,000 soldiers for a massive invasion of the mainland. This was a massive force, yet it was nowhere near enough to confront the significantly larger communist army. The most famous of Chiang's strategies to invade the mainland was Project National Glory, also known as Project Guoguang. Developed around 1960 to 1961, this strategy intended to take advantage of the disorder in China brought on by Mao's Great Leap Forward, which had led to a devastating famine. In spite of the vast size and boldness of the endeavor, the United States declined to back it, especially following the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961. As a result, by the mid-60s, the ambitions of initiating a nationalist invasion of China were thoroughly thwarted. When the People's Republic of China obtained nuclear weapons in 1964, Chiang's dreams of regaining the mainland had nearly disappeared. The anxiety over a nuclear clash with China, along with the unsuccessful prior invasion strategies, indicated the conclusion of significant military attempts to regain the mainland. Chiang now confronted the fact that Taiwan would serve as the permanent residence of the nationalist government. In 1954, Taiwan conducted its initial presidential elections, though they were anything but democratic. Rather than having a public election, over 1,500 delegates to the National Assembly chose the president for a 6-year term. Chiang, as expected, received overwhelming backing, obtaining 97% of the votes. This did not signify any broad public backing for Chiang, but instead illustrated the supremacy of the Kuomintang in the assembly. The economy in an authoritarian regime still reflects the enduring impacts of Chiang Kai-shek's governance. His attempts to uphold a distinct Chinese state continued for many years, and while the eventual downfall of his government in changing global recognition adversely affected Taiwan's international status, the legacy of Taiwan's economic success and its developing political system under Chiang's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, laid the groundwork for a democratic change. Notwithstanding the disputes regarding his authoritarian governance, Chiang's leadership, especially in ensuring Taiwan's existence against the communist danger, persists as an important part of the island's history. His individual legacy, represented by the Grand Memorial Hall created in his tribute, persists in sparking discussions regarding his influence on Taiwan's identity formation. The late 20th century witnessed a gradual yet notable transition to democracy in Taiwan, characterized by political reforms, the abolition of martial law, and the eventual conclusion of the Nationalist Party's rule. The shift led by Chiang's son was not merely about governance, but also about a society struggling to reconcile its authoritarian history with democratic principles. In the subsequent decades, Taiwan's global status enhanced, particularly post-1880s, and although it was never completely accepted by China, its trajectory separated into one of democratic liberty and economic success. In the end, the story of Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist administration embodies both the sorrows and successes of Taiwan's path as a nation. It stands as proof of the strength of a community that, in spite of the challenging situations they encountered, shaped their own destiny. His governance might have been authoritarian, yet it marked a time of collective national solidarity facing a shared external danger. And in the subsequent years, Taiwan would evolve into a contemporary democratic nation. The present condition of the island and its political dynamics would probably appear quite different if Chiang's dream of a free, independent Republic of China had not persisted during the Cold War and afterward. The legacy of Chiang Kai-shek is certainly a topic of intricate discussion. His impacts on contemporary China and Taiwan, along with his shortcomings and failures, illustrate a picture of an individual whose effects lasted for decades, but whose results were varied and frequently controversial. On one hand, Chiang Kai-shek is viewed as a patriotic Chinese leader, dedicated to safeguarding China's sovereignty and territorial unity amid foreign aggressions and internal conflicts. His guidance during the Northern Expedition, his opposition to Japanese invasion, and his attempts to unify China in the initial years of his rule all showcase a deep commitment to the country. If he had won the Civil War, it can be speculated that his nationalist vision for China could have resulted in a different path for the nation, circumventing the devastation of Mao Zedong's communist regime and potentially guiding the country toward modernization and stability sooner than it ultimately achieved under Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Nonetheless, Chiang's legacy is also tainted by the corruption and authoritarianism that characterize his rule. In the 1940s, the Kuomintang, KMT, was plagued by inefficiency, nepotism, and mismanagement, problems that ultimately resulted in the nationalist loss in the Chinese Civil War. Chiang's hesitation to introduce political and economic reforms, along with his personal cult of leadership, resulted in a government that found it difficult to secure public support, particularly as China faced the consequences of years of conflict and instability. His inability to tackle these systemic problems resulted in the collapse of the nationalist dream for a unified China, facilitating the emergence of communism. In Taiwan, Chiang's authoritarian governance persisted, yet his regime, despite its shortcomings, maintained Taiwan's identity as a sanctuary for Chinese nationalism and a counter to the communist regime on the mainland. His policies promoted an economic overhaul, although this took place alongside the persistent suppression of political liberties and the upkeep of a personality cult surrounding Chiang himself. Although Taiwan ultimately transitioned to democracy, Chiang's governance was marked by strict martial law and the absence of political diversity. Therefore, whether Chiang Kai-shek is seen as a patriot or a corrupt dictator relies on the perspective from which his actions are examined. His historical significance is unquestionable, But the issue of whether he might have guided China more effectively is complicated by his shortcomings as both a military commander and a politician. Was he a victim of the situation, struggling to uphold the nationalist cause during a time of conflict and division? Or was he a flawed leader whose vision, limited by authoritarianism, overlooked the chance to establish a more prosperous and stable China? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.